This is Liberty Law Talk, part of Liberty Fund's online library of law and liberty. Your host is Liberty Fund Fellow Richard Reinsch. Our web address is libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org. Today we are talking with Paula Baker about her new book, Curbing Campaign Cash, Henry Ford, Truman Newberry, and the Politics of Progressive Reform. Paula Baker is an associate professor of history at Ohio State University, and she is currently working on a book entitled The American Political Industry, which will provide a detailed history of campaign finance legislation reform attempts in America. Paula, great to have you on the show.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you, you've written a really interesting book about the Michigan Senate race of 1918, which featured one man we know very well. We know his name and his impact on this country, Henry Ford, and also a lesser-known figure, Truman Newberry, who faced off for the Senate seat that was open for that election. How did you come upon the Michigan Senate race of 1918, and why should we be attuned to the history of that campaign, and what does it have for us regarding campaign finance reform? What does it teach us?
Well, let's see. Lots of questions there. One goes back to the original design that I had for the general history of campaign finance, which still moves from the idea that campaigns are businesses, and so my approach was to think of it as a business and approach it almost as a set of business school cases. And this was one of my cases out of a whole long series. The case approach turned out to really get out of hand, and actually this case was one that demonstrated to me that the case approach wasn't working, where it had too many angles, had too much going on to be truncated, and wound up going and living on its own. And so the American political industry now moves much more in a chronological direction, still with the idea that campaigns are usefully approached as businesses that have needs for capital, yes, but also workers, also communication, and therefore thinking about finance alone winds up being way too narrow and self-defeating in connection with reform. Kicking that out of the way, this as a case seemed to be a no-brainer in that project, because it was the first test case really that was developed through the court system in connection with the first full-blown campaign finance legislation in the United States at the federal level. And so
you're saying, let me ask you, so this campaign between Henry Ford and Truman Newberry, and I want to come back and ask you how Henry Ford got involved and wanted to be a United States Senator, because that seems kind of interesting from what I know of Henry Ford. But in thinking about the regulatory campaign spending, what piece of legislation is involved in this race and who's accused of violating it?
In 1910, 1911, a strange bidding war takes place. There's concern about campaign finance. Previously, there had been legislation dealing with public employees, and there had been the Tillman Act before this that had to do with corporate financing of corporate contributions to campaigns. The 1911 Corrupt Practices Act deals more broadly and tries to there's this kind of funky bidding war that takes place in the Senate, in particular, that has to do with capping the amounts that campaigns for Congress and the Senate, capping the amount that they could spend, and also rolling in at that point limitations on corporations' ability to contribute to campaigns. So that's the legislation at issue. The violator in this case is not Henry Ford, who decided that he would not spend any, announced that he would not spend any money whatsoever to run for the Senate, and he, whether or not he did is harder to say. This is the kind of thing that Ford would have dealt with cash, and not with any contributions that were publicized. And under the Federal Corrupt Practices Act, this was all supposed to be publicized. As contributions were supposed to be publicized as well. But Truman Newberry and his managers were, and basically the whole campaign team were accused of violating the Corrupt Practices Act.
Now, it seems the background when we think about campaign finance reform, and one reads a lot of the criticisms of it, that in many respects, particularly with regard to McCain-Feingold, which is our major legislation of our time, it protects incumbents because they have the name recognition, they already have a war chest. They've done a lot of things for people. I mean, they can all point to these achievements in re-election campaigns. And how do you challenge that? And one way is to run a really effective, well-financed campaign. And it seems to me in this race that's clearly involved. I mean, Truman Newberry is, as you read, he's from an old money Detroit family. He's served in the military, served in the Navy. He's not in the state. The Federal Corrupt Practices Act, the way I read it, had severe limitations. I think it would be $60,000 in today's money. Is that right?
Yep.
On what you could spend. And of course, there was one huge loophole in that contributions from outside or from others that you could raise, you could spend that. You had a much larger cap on that. It was just your own money that you were severely limited on. So how does Truman Newberry compete? And he puts together, it seems like a modern campaign. He's got a money-raising operation. He's got a media operation. And he's really driving on issues. One issue in particular that's in play you write about is the League of Nations. And are we going to join or not join? And Newberry is a no vote, and Wilson is a yes, or excuse me, Ford is a yes vote. Is that? I mean, it seems to me that's part of what's going on behind the scenes in terms of Truman Newberry trying to gain an edge. Although he's not. I mean, you write about it, he's not actively campaigning, but the people in his campaign are.
It was a really strange campaign. Where neither candidate campaigns, and on top of it, by the time we get to October of 1918, the influenza epidemic is in full swing and affecting Michigan, and so there's a ban for that matter even on public meetings. So the candidates otherwise weren't about to go out and campaign for themselves in any event, and so they never appear, they never speak for themselves, and it's quite modern in that everything is basically a media campampign.
Now, was that common to? I mean, this in that period
no,
in a Senate race.
That's part of what really scared the Senate.
that there was an actual campaign.
That here was a guy, Truman Newberry, that. Was, again, as you say, a well-off individual from relatively old money. At least his father had amassed a bit of a fortune, and Truman Newberry himself had expanded upon it through his own investments. So there is that. But otherwise, he doesn't have a pile of name recognition. He had run for Congress once in the past in this kind of half-hearted way without winning, for that matter, the Republican primary. And so he had very little name recognition, and so here's this guy with very little name recognition, but he does have some funds, and here's what you can do with a media campaign at a moment in time when people are starting to get to be sensitive about the whole question of propaganda coming out of having witnessed what propaganda might accomplish in the course of World War I. Mm-hmm. So you can imagine how senators seeing this, incumbents themselves saying, "Oh my God,
yeah.
This can happen to us."
So there is that incumbent protection, kind of low ground part of this going on.
Sure. There's incumbent protection going on. There is also, it seems to me, the question of, in this case, fame, where incumbents certainly have an advantage in running for election. They already have organizations and name recognition and all of that, but no one beats Henry Ford for name recognition.
Yeah.
Certainly in Michigan and pretty much anywhere at that moment, and all of the kind of bad publicity around Ford hasn't really happened yet.
Okay.
So
okay.
it's a pretty much a clean slate, and Ford still turns up more or less as a hero, with the controversial part of Ford's public persona at this moment having to do with his support for, or his support for the League of Nations, and before that, his efforts to keep the United States out of World War I.
I wanted to ask you. I thought this was interesting, but I guess fits very well with first wave progressive political philosophy. Henry Ford enters both the Republican and Democratic primaries. I assume the message he's sending is he's above narrow partisanship, narrow party interest. He is, about the common good, we might say, for all of Michigan, and
the world.
The world. Yeah, Truman Newberry, of course, is a Republican.
He's not about just Michigan. He's about the world.
He's got okay. Yeah, that's a good point. Which when you say that's incredibly arrogant to assume that politics could ever be that that universal, so to speak. But yeah, progressivism, and this was a part of it, that politics needed to become more rational, more scientific. We really didn't need to have these continuing ideological battles. We could get beyond that and be about these goals of good government, clean government, distributing resources more broadly, et cetera. So Ford kind of plays into that moment. Newberry, I guess, runs afoul of it, although he doesn't, probably doesn't understand himself to be so. But yet he's, trying to win the election. Let's talk about, so when Newberry beats Ford in the Republican primary, he then has to face him in the general election because Ford has won the Democratic primary. In the general election, he then beats him there. And I'm curious to know and get your thoughts, because you mentioned World War I, and Woodrow Wilson certainly criticized by many for his efforts in World War I with regard to civil liberties and stifling dissent, and yet he immediately moves against Newberry. I think you say he doesn't even wait for the general election to be over.
One piece that I found pretty amazing was how politicized the Justice Department was in this case, where working with the Democratic National Committee, word is out that Democratic National Committeemen should be working and ready to forward any instances they could find of campaign irregularities on the part of Republicans, that the Justice Department is ready and willing to take a look at this stuff, and so there are people out investigating during the primary connected with that, and the initial complaint that comes in about Michigan doesn't instantly rise to the level of interest as far as the Justice Department is concerned, but then when the 1918 Senate elections go against Wilson, making it clear that he's not going to have the kind of majority is going to need for the league potentially, and certainly to organize the Senate. All of a sudden, there's a lot of interest in the Justice Department and a real effort to get this case moving and prosecuted as quickly as possible, with the only question being, whether they move to prosecute it in Michigan or in New York, where Truman Newberry was stationed during the war. So the politicized Justice Department actually struck me as something new here, where we do know about civil liberties, but this kind of political prosecution seems to me to be something new.
The political prosecution aspect of it, and you write at great length about that. So one question, just a factual question. So what is the colorable claim raised by the government against Newberry? I mean, what does it seem like he's done? Of just sheer violation of the spending limits of the Federal Corrupt Practices Act in both the primary and the general election?
The primary election, because the general election was quite clearly run by the Republican Party in the state, and so the general election wasn't at issue. It was completely the primary, because that's where, because parties weren't involved, candidates or their organizations at this point raised and spent their own money. One word on this is that this law was the Corrupt Practices Act was sort of peculiar in that it left this giant loophole, and it seemed as if that loophole was there with everybody's everyone involved in what debate there was about the legislation, and certainly it was possible for politicians for senators and House members to read legislation and know what it meant. Left this loophole there, basically on purpose. It had to be. It's hard to imagine otherwise.
So, in effect, the loophole is, this is part of the conversation. It seems with any campaign finance reform legislation is, where does the politics end up going, or how are those involved in legislation, able to craft, certain provisions that allow influence to be exercised in new ways. It seems with the Federal Corrupt Practices Act, so the focus is on spending, and we usually think about now the focus tends to be limiting contributions to campaigns or to issue advocacy campaigns, and of course, limiting spending seems to drive the money outside, or in terms of limiting spending of the candidate, but allowing much larger contributions to come in. So that's, I guess, one avenue around that. And of course, with McCain-Feingold, it seems to be, or some have argued, it allows wealthy candidates to step in because they're actually not limited, or at least that's my understanding. So that's, I guess that's in play. So Truman Newberry, he beats the rap, but barely. And there's also an attempt by the Senate, retroactively, you write about, to, in effect, impose a 100% tax on campaign expenditures, which certainly would send certainly would scare anyone from running for any federal office if you see that happen. It's a chilling device.
Yeah, and I was interested to see that there still are some law professors pursuing that idea as maybe a tax on campaign contributions as one way of limiting contributions to campaigns.
So through the tax. Yep. And that narrowly failed, though, right? It was a few votes short of passing. And so they failed to get an indictment in New York, if I remember correctly. They move in Michigan. Henry Ford gets involved, which is, it just seems to add to the sinister nature of this, with his own paid private investigators combing the state, trying to find evidence. And then, actually, they're able to bring a grand jury in Grand Rapids, Michigan, outside of any Newberry influence or people who would know him or his family. And then they get an indictment.
managed to pick decided that they wanted, the Ford people decided they wanted a different prosecutor, found one who had had some success previously in Indiana, who would eventually also run for public office as a Democrat in Indiana. And so they, found that. They found the right judge, who had basically announced that he thought the Newberry election was, a scandal, and that Newberry, he basically announces that as far as he's concerned, Newberry had already broken the law. So it was, all but a foregone conclusion that there would be, an indictment in this case.
Ask you, thinking about Newberry, barely surviving, he holds on. He is indicted. Ultimately, he's exonerated because there's a ruling that the Federal Corrupt Practices Act could not apply to primary elections. which of course opens up more unintended consequences. Then Newberry retires early. I think it's 4 years into his Senate seat. So just thinking more broadly about this episode. I mean, so unintended consequences. I mean, that's almost a truism when we think about regulatory actions, and yet it never seems to really break through to people when they're thinking of grand objectives. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on unintended consequences of the Federal Corrupt Practices Act in this regard, because it seems to me they're all over the place in your book.
Yeah, unintended consequences in the ruling itself, where I think there would have been a unanimous verdict that the federal judge in the Newberry case had completely misread the statute, that the statute didn't apply to the campaign organization. It only applied to individual candidate spending, and the judge, for reasons of his own, went off and decided that it applied to the campaign organization, and so that there would have been a unanimous court in that instance that would have sent it back to a rehearing, and at that point we probably would have had a pretty much clean. Would have been interesting in terms of consequences that didn't happen. It would have caused the Senate and House to really confront what they were trying to do with campaign finance. This way, they could skate by and decide that this piece of meaningless legislation would carry on and be and they would go back and revise it in the 1920s, and it would remain into the to the 1970s as this completely ineffective piece of legislation. But there it was, there it existed, and so Congress was able to get away without confronting that. So in that sense, an unintended consequence that kind of didn't happen. Unintended consequences also in that deciding that primary elections, the way we got to a 4-4, 4-5 kind of decision on this case was that primary elections weren't elections as the Constitution described, and they were instead the activities of private organizations, that is, political parties, which opens the door then to Southern white primaries, which would and Southern states would be on that one, and it would carry on until the 1940s.
One question I wanted to ask you. So in your research, going forward from 1918, do we see, because of the Federal Corrupt Practices Act and the precedent set by this campaign, more active campaigns? Is that another way people shift to the spending limits and the particular loopholes that are open in that act? Do we actually get the thing progressives don't want, which is a more competitive politics, more personality-driven politics, campaign machine-type politics?
The other irony here is that, sure, it leaves everything open for media politics, advertised politics, and if progressives really meant what they often talked about in terms of how politics ought to be nonpartisan and rational and issue-driven and all of that. Instead, what we get is a politics that's media-driven and personality-driven. And so, that where advertising is what's essential. On the other hand, if you've also gone ahead in terms of another irony of progressive reform and decided that parties should be curbed in whatever in their influence, then what do we have other than advertising? Campaigns still have to communicate with a public. Candidates still have to get their message out, and so advertising comes in and fills that gap where parties with the primary system are no longer effective in being not as effective as they had been in
so that's interesting.
Advancing candidacies and so forth.
And thinking, I mean, I guess I've read the story, and I haven't read it in a while. I mean, so if you were thinking of running for office, say before the Federal Corrupt Practices Act or before even the Tillman Act, I'm assuming so there were probably very few disclosures or things that you had to do. Basically you passed a hat around and you got going. I mean, there was an open field. It was open to anyone, but the party was heavily involved, I assume. And but it seems to me there's an opening for diversity in the sense of you could get real challenger candidates who weren't limited or burdened by a lot of regulation or a lot of spending limits or a lot of contribution limits. I mean, that seems to me a huge irony of campaign finance legislation, that it actually limits the field to the connected, to those who have really made a life out of politics.
I guess that...
that's just my observation. I don't know. I've wondered that. I've thought that.
In the wild card here is communication, I think, more than finance.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Where the press is basically partisan, connected with the political parties, funded by the political parties until about the 1850s or so, and with still a fair amount of party funding that happens after that. Before that, there's kind of straightforward, parties or the press, to about the 1850s or so. After that, it's a little more mixed, but chances are the press is still pretty partisan until about the 1890s, and then we begin to see a bit more of an independent press. And
do you think we lose something?
When we're talking about funding, the question is sort of money for what, and money for what at this point is increasingly by the 1900s on forward. It's for advertising and in the primaries it'll be for organization as well, because money in its money is used for something, and that something, it strikes me, is completely legitimate. That is advertising an organization, and the need for candidates to go ahead and create their own organizations as opposed to party organizations, which does potentially open things up, happens with primary elections, but that plus an increasingly independent press gets us to political advertising as the important venue for making yourself known to voters.
With the partisan press, does it decline as a consequence of campaign finance legislation? Or it seems to me it could be a good thing to have a partisan press. That sounds counterintuitive to most people, but.
Yeah, it's happening more or less independently of that, where the press is on one side able to, newspapers are able to go ahead and support themselves through commercial advertising, and and political advertising turns out to be a kind of bonus that they wind up getting as well.
Going forward and thinking, I guess I'm still trying to think of consequences of this Michigan race. So campaign finance reform, those who maybe we can say the Baptists and also the bootlegger. So what do they learn from this episode? I guess you say the Federal Corrupt Practices Act is reformed in the 1920s, but largely stays on the books. Is that the major piece of campaign finance restrictive type legislation that we have until later attempts in the later 20th century? Or other things come online, or other ways come on to try and shape this process?
There are smaller revisions where, in the 1930s, a coalition of conservative, or at least conservative in this sense, in this connection, Democrats and Republicans look to, and then in the 1940s, look to limit the ability of unions to contribute to political campaigns. That crops up as an issue in the 1930s. Also, limits on the political participation of office holders or civil servants. That also crops up in the 30s. So there's that. But as far as the spending limits and such, that's all just a kind of dead letter until the contribution limit approach. Then in the 1970s, there are people working on this, and there are hearings held and all of that through the 1950s into the 1960s, but nothing arises out of it. The shorter-term consequences of this is that it taught the Senate that you really could get rid of people who, for whatever reason, the Senate found to be, or the House found to be,
so politically objectionable.
Objectionable, pretty much by their own life.
Yeah,
and here,
and also a threat to your political career, as we discussed at the beginning.
Yeah,
to your fortunes. Yes.
So Newberry is not even though he's in that sense cleared by the Supreme Court, the Senate goes back and runs other hearings, and with changes in the composition of the Senate, with the 1922 elections, it seemed clear that yet another round of hearings was going to happen, and so at that point he resigned office and went back to private life, and really never had much to do with politics ever again, in contrast to Ford, who carried on a kind of quixotic political career. But the Senate would look back at other candidates who plainly hadn't violated this law, whose campaigns were legal, but decided that that the Senate could use its power to act as judge of its own members, to go after them as well, and campaign finance issues tended to be kind of a low-hanging fruit because, hey, basically everybody spends more than what the limit was, unless it's an election in the South that's basically uncontested, or some places in the North where elections were pretty much uncontested. So there are a number of heads that roll in that connection through the 1920s, and it showed no sign of ending really until the Democratic majorities in the 1930s, where the chances of removing a person would be advantageous, would tip the balance of the Senate or the House, when that was no longer at issue. Basically, this set of Senate or congressional prosecutions comes to an end, and the ability of Congress to do this remains kind of up in the air. None of the people who lost their seats decided to challenge what Congress had done in the courts, and that doesn't happen finally until the 1960s.
So the McCain-Feingold legislation remains on the books. We see unintended consequences coming out of that. Of course, your book, I think, provides a way really to think about overall campaign finance reform and the various approaches to it and what it could lead to. I'm curious to know, I mean, as we end, I'm just thinking, I mean, so what are maybe some finer points of how to think about reform or how to think about campaigns and issue campaigns in general? I mean, is it something like full disclosure, as some have advocated, and allow really no limits, or is it, the voters are informed? We have numerous ways, an infinite number of ways to get information, aggregate information, analyze it, and we should just let things proceed as they will.
I guess I have a couple of thoughts on this. One is that thinking about money in a vacuum is a mistake. That money communicates a lot of things. It communicates whether or not a candidate is viable, whether or not a candidate has support. So it's a message in that sense. But otherwise, it's worth keeping in mind that campaign funds are spent for something, and what they're spent on is again generally organization, offices, organizing volunteers, campaign workers, all that kind of stuff, as well as advertising in all of its forms. And do we really want a system that makes that process so complex that in order to run for office, we need a team of lawyers to make sure that everything is straight and narrow. And also in connection with that, whether how the system we have in place, what flows from that is a string of consequences and shapes how campaigns make decisions, how they organize, how they reach out to voters, how they interact with interest groups, and money is not in a vacuum. It's connected with all of these things, and thinking about those connections strikes me as really important in any kind of campaign finance regime. On the other hand, the disclosure, spend what you want.
Seems to me we've also seen with the disclosures. I mean,
it could be creepy.
If you think about, let's say it's like 1950s. Let's say you're in Alabama and you've given money to the NAACP. The Alabama State Legislature tried to force those contributions to be publicly available. I can't remember if they actually succeeded in doing that. Of course, now you're at risk in a lot of ways. And like as we saw in the California amendment to the California State Constitution prohibiting same-sex marriage, we saw a lot of attempts to publish names of people that had contributed to the campaign to prohibit same-sex marriage, and a number of them lost their jobs. I remember one I was reading about, she was a chef at a major restaurant in L.A., and she ended up, for the sake of the restaurant, just resigning. So, all of that stuff is in play. And also, you mentioned at the beginning of your answer, thinking about the army of lawyers. I can remember being at a speech I heard Bradley Smith give a number of years ago, where he read a letter in the course of the speech from a challenger candidate who had served in the Marine Corps. He had been in Gulf War I, wanted to run as a challenger candidate in a primary, and ended up running afoul a lot of the regulations, largely because it seemed of just not having the resources to report properly and keep his information, et cetera, be able to give it to the FEC in the manner demanded, and almost incurred some significant liabilities. And the letter from this young Marine was, in effect, I can only conclude that the meaning of these regulations is to keep a lot of people out of the process, to keep challengers out. And I think, when you think about it, of course, people have a lot of intentions and meanings, but that seems to be unavoidable in a lot of this.
Yeah. And one other point. A while back, in a collection of essays, I did a piece on the 2008 Obama campaign, or took that as a kind of jumping off point to talk about the how it seems as if kind of two progressive era ideas, the secret ballot and campaign finance reform, are increasingly at odds. And so you contribute to a campaign, and increasingly, particularly with technology and the internet, we're encouraged to, and it's made easier for small contributions as well as some larger ones to fund campaigns. But that information is publicly available, and I was also kind of struck to learn that if you go to the FEC website, it's easy enough to find the small contributions too, even though they're not reported, not supposed to be public in the same way. You just I was just fooling around and was searching on some zip codes and all of that, and it was something that first came to my attention in looking at I was out of town and reading a newspaper, and I was, wait a second, why is there this list in this paper of people who had given $100 contributions to one campaign or another? I'm like, wait a second, this isn't supposed to be reported, right? I go to the FEC website, and there it is. Searched, and so at that point, what happens to the secret ballot? Maybe everybody's okay with this, but are they really?
Yes. Well, certainly, a lot of times, Google, information comes on people who have given, $2,500, $5,000. That seems, I guess that's legal, but I guess that always seems to me like, oh my gosh, okay.
But even the smaller contributions where someone says, okay, I'm going to give $199 and fall beneath the reportable limits, and whoops, nope. Yeah. And from there, of course, you Google the names, come up with Facebook pages.
Exactly. You put together a political profile. Paula, it was great talking with you and about your book, about this campaign of 1918, about campaign finance reform. Thank you so much. The book is Curbing Campaign Cash: Henry Ford, Truman Newberry, and the Politics of Progressive Reform. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is your host, Richard Greinch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.